So in these last PowerPoints, we're going to be looking at journalism and really its growth over the last really kind of 100 years, particularly the growth of broadcast journalism and the impact that it has had on our socially and culturally, and the fact that broadcast journalism has become really the go-to medium for citizens to find out what's going on. And we'll talk about how really during one weekend in November of 1963, the importance of print journalism was replaced by the importance of broadcast journalism, and how that really changed. And we'll talk about 4 events that have changed, particularly broadcast journalism, into what it is today, and then look at some of the technical aspects of particularly television journalism, and of course the issues related to journalism generally. First, though, we have to kind of take a step back and look at why journalism has become an important part of our culture and our society, by going back and looking at what the founders of this country wanted after being under British rule for so long in the early years of this continent. What were the founders, now that they had this new country, what were they going to do with it? What did they want it to change into after being subject to a monarchy? First thing is, the founders wanted a republic. And what is a republic? The idea, the concept of a republic is that the power of the government rests with the people. That is, that the people are supposed to be the ones who make the decisions, they're the ones who determine their own lives. Now, the problem with that is that when you have 50 million or 100 million or 150 million or 200 or 300 million, it's hard to get a whole bunch of people together to make decisions for everyday life. So instead, a republic is also a representative government. That is, because there are so many of us, because it's hard for us all to get together and make decisions simply just because there are so many people, we elect representatives to make our decisions for us. And if we don't like the decisions that our representatives make, then we can replace them. We can have another election, and those representatives can be replaced to do what we, the people, want to do. They also wanted a democracy, meaning first, that all eligible members of the society have a say in who their representatives are. Now, the important part here is eligible members, because there are, through our history, the eligibility to participate in our democracy has changed. In the early years, it was only men, and even before that, it was only propertied men who could vote in elections. Then eventually, African Americans, after their freedom from slavery after the Civil War, were allowed to vote in elections. Of course, there were difficulties along the way, with some states imposing difficulties, things like poll taxes or literacy tests on African Americans in order to allow them to participate. Women were not allowed to be a part of the voting public until 1920. And even up until the 1970s, those under 21 years old, 21 years old was the cutoff for being eligible to vote. But since young men were being sent to Vietnam during that time to fight and die, an amendment was proposed to the Constitution that the eligible voting age be lowered to 18, so that those men who were going over to Vietnam might have some say in whether or not they actually wanted to go to Vietnam. So eligibility is an important part here. Even today, there are some who are not eligible. And the founders determined that in order for the citizens to make informed decisions about whom they were going to elect to their representative bodies, the public needed to be informed. And again, relying on their experience with the colonial governments and the monarchy from Britain, the founders determined that the best way for people to be informed is with a free press, a press that is not controlled by the government. So the press must be independent and uncontrolled by the government. That is, in fact, and to a certain extent, it should be the free press that is keeping its eye on the government. So within the Constitution, the founders determined that we should make a rule that says that Congress shall make no law respecting or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So Congress and no legislative body can come in and try and control the press, tell them what to put in, what to publish, what to tell the citizens of the country, so that the citizens can get free and accurate information about their government in order to make their decisions. This has been considered so important that often the press is referred to as the fourth estate, or really the fourth branch of government. The three established branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, are articulated in the Constitution, and the founders felt that this was as important, that the fourth estate, the press, is really a watchdog group of government. In fact, it's so important that this is the only profession that has any mention in the United States Constitution. So what we're going to look at here is really kind of start off looking at the differences between print and broadcast media, because there is a difference. We've gone through in our technologically advanced age, we've gone through, as we've talked about before, a kind of a convergence of media, with everything sort of winding up on the internet. And some have argued that there isn't really any difference between print and broadcast, when in reality there are significant differences. Then we'll talk really about broadcast news history, again kind of reviewing a little bit of radio journalism, and then going into television journalism. And then really the three areas that have changed journalism, particularly broadcast journalism, into what it is now, and then a look at the issues and controversies. So there are basically three differences between broadcast journalism and print journalism. The first is the medium or the environment that is used. Print uses space. When a story is included in a newspaper, there are a certain number of column inches, a certain number of space that is allowed or filled. Broadcast, on the other hand, is time. Stories are a certain amount of time. Commercials are a certain amount of time. Programs are a certain amount of time. Usually in programming and advertising, the conventions are an hour program or a half-hour program. In advertising, it's a minute to 30 seconds. As far as broadcast journalism, stories can be anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes, or even when you have more in-depth investigations like programs like 60 Minutes, the segments can be anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. So the difference really between print and broadcast here is where that information goes. In print, it goes into specific space. In broadcast, it is limited by a certain amount of time. Really, and then what do each of the media have as goals? What are they trying to achieve? Print is very good at explanation because they have time, because they have space. They can use as much space as is needed to explain something, to provide a lot of detail. Broadcast, on the other hand, takes the audience to where the event is happening, where the action is happening right now. The problem with print is that it's kind of a terminal medium. You put it in print, it goes out, and people can see it. People can read it, but they only have that copy. Whereas in broadcast, broadcasters can show or tell people what's happening as events are changing or as actions are changing. This is changing a little bit with for print as newspapers and magazines go to the internet because they can update information as new information becomes available. And then the third difference is really kind of the tools. Print uses ideas. Print uses words. And this is really the value of along really with the second difference with print is that print can really go into explanation and explain explain meanings of ideas and give examples and really flesh out something. And they do it through language. Broadcasting is more pictures and sounds. That doesn't mean that writing isn't important in broadcast, but its primary impact is going to be with the sounds of the actions or the events, with the visuals of the actions or the events. And again, there are some changes going on here with print in that on internet pages for newspapers, very often now they're coming back with interviews, the verbatim recorded interviews of sources or showing video related to a particular event. So print has had to adapt a little bit to really kind of the desires of the viewing audience, and again, part of this has to do again with the idea that so many people nowadays turn to broadcast for their news instead of print. So the next thing to look at, as with all the media, is the history of broadcast news. And again, some of this we've already talked about with respect to radio, but the majority of this is going to be related to television news. So if you remember, back when radio was in its very, very early infancy, those mechanical types, the entrepreneurs, those who had their own little radio transmitters and basically their own little radio stations, were looking for something to put on the radio. And one of the things they did was reading newspapers. So journalism has been a part of radio broadcasting and radio programming for quite a long time now, right from its inception. The stories that they that they read were not their own. They didn't have a news department to go out and gather this information, but it was a part of the programming. And then, of course, KDKA was the first to broadcast the election results, 1920. And as war came to the United States with the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, it was radio that brought as much information as was available on the day of the attacks, December 7th. And as the attacks continued in the Philippines and other parts of the Pacific Rim countries, it was radio that was giving that information to the public. Then, even before the attacks on Pearl Harbor, American radio correspondents were in Europe watching the expansion of Germany and the Nazis into different parts of Europe, the defeat of France, the Battle of Britain. Edward R. Murrow, the CBS kind of senior correspondent in Europe, was there with what were called his Murrow boys, who were all around Europe reporting on changes in European governments as war was coming closer and closer. As radio network news starts to decline, as the popularity of television increases, local radio stations start doing their own news reporting. And this is really going to become a very important part of particularly local radio news, or local radio content, simply because they're reporting on things that are important to their listeners. What's the city government planning? What kinds of what events are going on the weekend? What kind of, are their taxes going up? Is there a problem with their schools? So local radio news becomes a very important of local radio station programming. One man who had some significant contributions to local radio news was a man named Gordon McClendon. He came up with two broadcast news innovations that we now just consider a part of everyday local news. First are what would be referred to as field recordings. That is actually taking recording equipment out into the field, and instead of doing an interview with someone and then writing down notes that in shorthand of what the person said or the ideas that the person is giving out, actually recording the entire interview. This, of course, was made possible with the new audio tape technology. And then once you had the recording, you could bring it back to the news station and edit out what you didn't want, and only the particular part of that interview that you needed for your radio story. Those little parts of radio interviews were known as actualities. And some places are still using that term as reference to radio interviews. The second thing that McClendon pioneered was the all-news radio format. We don't think twice about that nowadays. There are lots of stations, local stations, network stations that do this, have all news or all sports or all commentary types of programming, simply because it's not very expensive. You hire 3 or 4 people to come on air during a 12-hour day and just talk to people, or give their opinions or whatever. For this to happen in the 1950s was quite a step, quite a different step. His first radio was in Tijuana, Mexico, XETRA, but it was successful enough that he brought it to the United States in the 1960s to WNUS in Chicago. And like I say, this is a format that is very popular and is very lucrative today because it doesn't cost a lot of money you're not buying programming, you're basically just having people talk. Radio news today is relatively innocuous. That means basically meaning that it's there, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. Newsrooms, radio newsrooms can be anywhere from 1 to 5 people, depending on the size of the market. Bigger markets are going to have more people. Smaller markets, you may have one person who is the news director and the primary reporter and anchor. And some radio stations may not have newsrooms at all. Their programming is primarily news breaks, usually at the top of the hour for 5 minutes. While there is still, in some places, local orientation, in other words, local reporters going out and doing local radio stories, a lot of stations have network programming 24 hours a day, and there may be included in that some network news for with national and international news, but not a lot of local news. Television news, on the other hand, as it started out, was generated primarily by the networks. Local TV stations still hadn't really budgeted for television news. They were just getting started. They were still having to make sure that they had the capital to keep the television station going, and so hiring people to go out and shoot video or report on stories didn't really figure into local TV stations. So networks are the ones that primarily provided news coverage for TV stations. And in the early days, there wasn't much to them. A lot of it was newsreels. That is really kind of news reports, international, national news reports that's put on film, and then the film played back for the networks and the local TV stations that were their affiliates. The NBC, or the Camel Newsreel Theater, was it's called the first real daily newscast. It appeared on NBC, and it was really the kind of 15-minute newsreel that you might also still see in theaters. The first television newscast to have actually a person sitting behind a desk and reading the news to the audience was the CBS TV News in 1948. Douglas Edwards, a veteran radio newscaster, was really the first television news anchor. It was 15 minutes long. It had a lot of rewritten wire stories, or actually AP wire stories that Edwards might just read right off the wire, and some film, again, related to newsreels that were put together by outside sources. NBC came along then a year later with the Camel Caravan News. John Cameron Swayze, who was in journalism for a long time, he also was a pitchman, a commercial announcer for Timex watches. Their newscast was expanded eventually from 10 minutes to 15 minutes long. Also, if you look in the picture here, you'll notice that Camel News Caravan actually promoted Camel cigarettes very, very prominently. both in the title of the program and on the in the picture that on the desk that's where Cameron Swayze read the news. CBS News was the first to use the very important technology of videotape, and they did it in trying to solve the time shifting problem. Remember, if a program originated on the East Coast at 6:30 at night, it was actually 4:30 in the afternoon on the West Coast. So nobody was watching on the West Coast because they were usually in their cars driving home. So CBS News was the first to record the original half hour or the original newscast on the East Coast and then replay it for the West Coast 2 hours later so that there was a prime time audience. NBC was the first to come up with a novel idea of, instead of having one anchor, having two anchors. And the two anchors were actually in separate cities. David Brinkley, the Huntley-Brinkley Report started in 1956. David Brinkley on the left was in New York City, and Chet Huntley on the right was in Washington, D.C. What they were best known for was their close at the end of the newscast, where Chet would say, "Good night, David," and David would say, "Good night, Chet," and then turn to the camera and say, "And good night to you from NBC News." Many a comedian helped make fun of that in their routines. CBS is the first to go from 15 minutes to 30 minutes in 1963. NBC followed a year later, and we are still in the 30-minute format for nightly newscasts at the network level. There was some time during the 1970s when television news and journalism was really hitting its stride and becoming very popular after covering the Watergate scandal, where some of the networks thought that, instead of running just a half an hour, maybe they would expand to an hour, running from 5:30 to 6:30 in the Central Time Zone and 6:30 to 7:30 in the Eastern Time Zone. But local affiliates just said no, that's not going to happen, because that's when local TV stations have their half-hour news from 6 to 6:30, and that would mean some significant changes for them, which they did not want to do. Probably one of the biggest events in television news history is in 1962, when CBS Evening News hired Walter Cronkite as their permanent anchor. Walter Cronkite stayed for 20 years and had the unusual distinction in the 1970s as being the most trusted man in America. The American public had really kind of given up on politicians and others, businessmen, used car dealers, whatever. And it was Walter Cronkite that the vast majority of people really trusted. And this was of course, a big positive for CBS, because more people were turning to CBS News than any of the other newscasts. While CBS and NBC were relatively successful in their first attempts at network newscasts, ABC had to go through a couple of problems. First, they started in 1948, and it just went nowhere. Their first attempt at a nightly newscast. They tried again in 1953, this time with a person who was a well-known personality, in that he was basically a game show host, John Daly. So he was a familiar face to audiences, but he wasn't really considered a news person. even though they had some failures and got a late start, that actually kind of led to ABC News trying to do some innovative things. In 1960 or 1976, ABC brought in two veteran journalists hired them away from the other two networks. Barbara Walters was a investigative journalist from NBC. She was on the Today Show on NBC at the time that she was hired by ABC. Harry Reasoner was well known for being a correspondent, but also being one of the correspondents on CBS's 60 Minutes. So ABC hires these two people, and in the process is the first to try having a female anchor as a network anchor 5 nights a week. The problem was that these two just didn't get along. ABC paid a lot of money to steal them away from NBC and CBS, and the whole thing basically blew up in their faces. Both had significant egos. Both had reputations for being the ones who, were in charge. And so when it came down to actually putting them on the same anchor set, it just did not work. So even though the male-female dual anchor didn't work, ABC was willing to try something new, even more new, and building off that dual anchor, tried a format with 3 different anchors, one in Washington, one in London, and one in Chicago. The anchor in Chicago was actually the first African American to be a daily network news anchor, Max Robinson.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight.
There were 3 of us then. I was in London. Where on earth did I get that jacket? We all had more hair. Max Robinson, the first black American anchor on a network newscast, was in Chicago. Frank Reynolds was in Washington. Frank began with something of a mission statement.
Speaking for all the men and women of ABC News, I promise you an accurate, responsible, and meaningful report on events at home and abroad.
We still believe in that. And other things don't change. We had stories then about a tire recall. The debate about abortion seemed just as intense then. We had a short story about a man who had taken what he said was a bomb into one of the World Trade Towers.
The police negotiating team moved in and began to talk with Fratchek through translators.
By broadcast time, he'd not yet surrendered.
NASA finally has women and black astronauts.
And our science editor, the late Jules Bergman, whose voice is all through the movie Apollo 13, did a report on the future of the space shuttle and the first women astronauts.
I'd like to fly any mission, actually. The intent of a mission specialist is to train us to be generalists and to learn a little bit about every field. And I don't really have anything particular in mind right now. I'd be glad to fly in anything that they let me fly.
The sound bites were all longer then than they are today. The country's attention span has changed. Perhaps we in television are partly to blame. How long ago is 25 years? Notice that we all had typewriters, not computers, and you can hear the clickety-clack of the news machines in the background.
Our major story tonight concerns brave men who dare to speak their minds.
Frank, the men you're referring to went on trial in the Soviet Union today in cases almost certain to further strain Soviet-American relations.
And finally on this day, in 1978, we were deep in the Cold War. Our lead story was the treason trial in Moscow of 2 Jewish dissidents, Alexander Ginsburg and Anatoly Sharansky. It was not easy to cover the news in the Soviet Union.
Western reporting is severely limited. First, because no Western newsman is allowed to attend, and in our case, because a film report our correspondent delivered to Moscow airport never arrived here in the West.
But that night we did 6 reports on the trial from Moscow.
The Soviets are holding unusual twice-a-day briefings on the trial, but only a statement is read, no questions are answered.
And Israel.
This is Bill Siemens. Prime Minister Begin reacted in the Knesset today by suggesting how President Carter could help even more.
From Jimmy Carter's White House with Sam Donaldson.
The Soviet move has upset, even angered White House officials, who today seem determined to make the Russians pay for it.
Barbara Walters interviewed the lawyer Alan Dershowitz about the Soviet legal system.
This trial is a farce.
And we had commentary at the end of the broadcast then from Howard K. Smith, who said that night the Soviets could only rule through tyranny.
Forced obedience is thus the very air the state lives by.
How the world has changed. Max Robinson and Frank Reynolds have both since died.
The this innovative type of setup was kept by ABC for about 5 years, and eventually went to the more traditional one anchor show in 1983, keeping Peter Jennings as their primary anchor on the daily newscast. And really, at that point, and in the 1980s, the early part of the 1980s, 3 men were established as the news anchors for each of the networks, and stayed that way for about 20 years each. Like I said, ABC kept Peter Jennings as their primary anchor in 1983, and he tragically died in the newsroom from a heart attack in 2005. He was known to be a very a heavy smoker and died of a heart attack. NBC Nightly News was taken over by Tom Brokaw after John Chancellor, who'd been there for about 10 years, retired. Brokaw came on in 1982 and was there until 2004. Dan Rather, on the other hand, had some significant problems at the end of his tenure. He took over for Walter Cronkite in 1981 when he retired, and was a stellar news anchor at CBS until 2005. He did a report on George W. Bush, in the 2004 presidential election. He did a report that claimed that George W. Bush was a pilot in the Air National Guard of Alabama, and the report said that he had not been actually doing his required service. He was a pilot during the Vietnam era, but did not go over to Vietnam and do his service there. Rather, he did it in the Air National Guard in Alabama. And when you are in the Air National Guard, you have a certain number of meetings you are required, a certain number of hours each month that you are required to fly to keep up to your efficiency level. And Rather came up with had a story that said that he didn't do it and that his records were falsified. Of course, the Bush campaign in 2004 denied it and attacked Rather and his the accuracy of his report. Rather stood by, and his producer stood by their report, but eventually the Bush campaign came up with documents that said that the report was false, and they had witnesses, and so Rather was dismissed from CBS. He is still active. He is on the AXS channel now doing interviews. He appears every once in a while on networks, different news networks, doing interviews as a pundit. So he's still active, and if it hadn't been for this kind of mini scandal, probably would have stayed at CBS for a number of years after that. But really, this was the these men were the faces of network news for 20 years. Everything was stable, and then really about the middle of the 2000s, everything just kind of fell apart. Jennings died, Rather was dismissed, and Brokaw decided to retire. And after that, there was really a merry-go-round of different anchors that have been in the anchor chairs at all three of the network news channels. ABC started with a dual anchor of Elizabeth Vargas and Bob Woodruff until Woodruff was injured in Afghanistan, severely injured in Afghanistan, and was out of work for about a year. Vargas stayed there, continued anchoring for a while, and then was replaced by Charles Gibson and Diane Sawyer, who are actually the ABC Good Morning America anchors. So they were doing double duty in the morning and in the evening at ABC. And since then, John Muir has become the primary anchor at ABC World News Tonight. CBS Evening News went out and looked for a big name and a familiar face in Katie Couric, who had been at NBC's The Today Show for many, many years. They paid her a lot of money to come over to really kind of push their severely problematic ratings, the CBS Evening News. Her ratings weren't bad, but they weren't what CBS News expected, the CBS executives expected. And so eventually they restructured her contract so that she would become kind of an editor at large. It's kind of the title they give out of the way news anchors. So she would do some specials for CBS News, do some, commentary kind of thing. And she was replaced by Bob Schieffer, who was, again, a very experienced broadcast journalist, as her replacement. But he made it clear that this was a temporary position for him, because he was not going to be doing an evening newscast. He just didn't want to do that. He wanted to report. And so eventually he was replaced by Scott Pelley, who was again a correspondent for 60 Minutes. Scott Pelley is interesting because he was there when the Trump administration began back in 2017, and with the statements that Donald Trump had made through his campaign and into his presidency that were out and out falsehoods, out and out lies. Scott Pelley was one of the few right from the beginning to call Donald Trump as president of the United States a liar. He called him, he said, this is not what the president is saying is not true. Here are the correct facts. And eventually he, I think, probably bowed to pressure and gave up that anchoring position, and Jeff Glor replaced him about a year and a half ago. The only place where it was relatively calm was at NBC, where Brokaw's retirement made the heir apparent. Brian Williams, the new NBC Nightly News anchor. But then Brian Williams got into some trouble when he was in Afghanistan, or reported that when he was in Afghanistan, he was in a helicopter crash, and that he survived it and had minor injuries, but that he gave that as a story of his journalistic adventures. When in reality, witnesses came forth and said, no, he wasn't in a helicopter crash. And so his credibility went to hell. He was out of the news business for about a year and a half. and then came back and now has a program on MSNBC called The 11th Hour. Lester Holt took his place. Lester Holt was the weekend anchor, and Lester Holt has been their main anchor at NBC Nightly News ever since. So that's really kind of the broadcast news history of where we are up to this point. The next PowerPoint will be a look at three areas that changed journalism into the modern journalism that it is today, and that is really has to do with four important historical events that changed modern journalism, and then the technical aspects, and really how the access of the public to journalists and television news has changed.